We'll get this show on the road. Welcome, everyone. We'll start momentarily. A few housekeeping items to get started. Please remain muted unless you are asked to speak. At any time, feel free to write your transit and Vision Zero related questions for the speakers in the chat. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording, along with other meeting materials, will be posted online. The last 20 minutes reserved for feedback. Thank you so much for joining us for this community engagement meeting on transit and Vision Zero. Today, we seek to build on conversations that formed the 2021 Climate Action Plan. And now that we're in the implementation phase, we're using this time to provide you with a brief update on transit and Vision Zero. And then we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on current projects, particularly around their impacts, ways to improve the projects, and how to best align with your vision for Albuquerque. First, I would like to pass things off to Christopher Ramirez, who will do our land acknowledgement.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Good evening, everybody. I'm Christopher Ramirez. I am with Together for Brothers. I use they or he pronouns. We've been doing a land acknowledgement since 2019, and thanks to the city of Albuquerque for allowing us to share our land acknowledgement that's available on T4B's website. Albuquerque and New Mexico are on indigenous land. Albuquerque is on Tiwa and Caris land. This includes current Isleta and Sandia pueblos, as well as Laguna and Santa Ana, and also other pueblos that do not exist today. New Mexico has 23 tribes and sovereign nations, including 19 pueblos, 3 Apache, and the Navajo or Dene. We ask permission and blessings, including recognizing the land taken and resistance of indigenous communities for centuries.
Thank you very much, Christopher. I'd like to start by introducing myself and our presenters. I am Sandra West, the city's sustainable waste specialist and tonight's facilitator. In this hour, you will hear from Albert Lee, the city's sustainable transportation specialist, Carrie Barkhurst, our city's senior transit planner, Valerie Hermanson, our city's public works strategic program manager and Vision Zero program lead. And you've already heard from Christopher Ramirez, who's the co-founder and executive director of Together for Brothers. We are also joined by Kelsey Rader, the city's sustainability officer, who is here to help answer your questions. Today, we're going to provide a brief overview of Transit and Vision Zero projects and programs, both what is new and what is currently planned. Afterwards, we'll cover how you can help. Spoiler alert, it's feedback. The last 20 minutes again are reserved for your questions on Transit and Vision Zero. We will also share some additional resources with you and ways to contact us after the meeting. And please keep in mind that our next community engagement meeting will be centered around electric vehicles, including buses. Thus, please save your electric vehicle related questions for our next meeting so that we can focus on capturing all of the other Transit and Vision Zero feedback and questions today. Thank you so much, and I'd like to turn it over to Albert Lee. Albert, you might be muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Sandra. Before we get to our presenters, I want to briefly talk about what sustainable transportation is. Sustainability is often described as a three-legged stool that tries to equally balance the environment, the economy, and our society. But I like to view it as a series of concentric circles, which you can see on the right there. Where our society and economy depends on a healthy environment to function well, and where the economy serves to benefit the well-being of our society and our environment. The table on the left shows 6 characteristics of sustainable transportation and brief descriptions of each characteristic. Sustainable transportation is active, accessible, equitable, ecological, healthy, and safe. Each of our presenters will be touching upon these characteristics in their presentations. Next slide, please. So what does sustainable transportation look like on the ground? It looks like the hierarchy on the left, where walking, biking, and public transit are prioritized over shared and private vehicles. These priorities and characteristics of sustainable transportation are built into the four focus areas of our 2021 Climate Action Plan, which are shown on the right: transit access and investment, active transportation, education and safety, and vehicle emissions reductions. The ultimate goal is to reduce the city's greenhouse gas emissions, where transportation makes up about 41% of total greenhouse gas emissions, as well as being a major source of local air and water pollution. Next slide, please. Today, you will hear some details about our sustainable transportation programs, including Vision Zero, the ABQ Ride Forward Network Study, Zero Fares, and other transit programs. Next slide, please. This is an overview of sustainability projects that the city has completed, that are ongoing or are upcoming. The completed projects.
I thought you turned the sound off. Apparently not.
Sorry about that. The completed projects include the Vision Zero Action Plan, Complete Streets Ordinance, the Zero Fares pilot program, and incorporating 5 new electric buses into the transit fleet. Ongoing and upcoming work involves Vision Zero program prioritization and implementation, developing the ABQ Ride Forward Network Plan, and pursuing funding for more electric buses. So with that, I will conclude and pass on the presentation to Valerie, who will talk more about the Vision Zero program.
Great, thanks so much, Albert. Hi, everyone. My name is Valerie Hermanson, and I manage the city's Vision Zero and active transportation planning efforts. And I'm here tonight to share information about our Vision Zero efforts. But first, what is Vision Zero? So Vision Zero is a mindful shift in how we think about transportation safety. It starts with an ethical belief that no one should die or be seriously injured on our roadways. And this chart kind of shows that traditional traffic safety approach versus a Vision Zero approach, as which you can see they're very different. Each year, over 40,000 people die in traffic crashes. And there's this implicit assumption that the amount of death and public injury on our roadways is inevitable. However, I want to point out that these traffic collisions are not traffic accidents, they're traffic crashes, which are preventable. So Vision Zero is also about a mindful shift in the language that we choose to use when we talk about crashes and collisions. And it's important to note that these are not accidents. Accident implies a sense of inevitability, and what it does is it diminishes the need for accountability. The reality is that humans make mistakes. We're imperfect beings. Within the context of our roadways, when a person makes a mistake, it should not result in a fatality or an injury. Vision Zero may seem like a lofty goal. I recognize that, but I like to point out that places are reaching zero traffic deaths and serious injuries. Oslo, Norway reached zero bike ped fatalities in 2019, and a little bit closer to home in Hoboken, New Jersey, they reached zero traffic deaths in 2018. Next slide, please. Best and standard practice for Vision Zero efforts is to use a data-driven approach. This map shows Albuquerque's high fatal and injury network, or the HFIN, as well as what's called the vulnerability index, or an equity index. The HFIN takes 5 years of crash data so that we can see where recurring fatal and injury crashes are happening. Elevating equity with the implementation of Vision Zero efforts is a best practice nationally, and it's also something that we prioritize with our Albuquerque Vision Zero efforts. We worked with our Office of Equity and Inclusion to identify 8 vulnerability indicators, and those are populations over 65, populations under 17, people with a disability, non-white population, limited English proficiency, multifamily housing units, and households with no vehicle. So the vulnerability index essentially identifies communities that rely on walking, biking, or taking transit to get around. And this on this map here that you see, this is our recently updated high fatal and injury network. The darker blue colors indicate a higher vulnerability, with the lighter blue indicating a lower vulnerability. And when we overlay the HVIN with the vulnerability index, it's very clear where we need to prioritize our traffic safety improvements. Next slide, please. There is no one solution to eliminate traffic deaths and serious injuries on our roadways. And so it's really important to combat this challenge through a comprehensive approach. And the Vision Zero Action Plan was released in May 2021, and I identified these 6 key bullet points at the top of the slide. My office in DMD, we organize Bike to Work Day, which is now Bike to Wherever Day. And we also organize Bike Through Porque to encourage folks to try bicycling for transportation. Education and encouragement are important. However, national best practice shows that the best approach to reaching zero traffic deaths and injuries is to prioritize roadway design and safe speeds. Engineering and roadway design is important since we know that changing the way our roads are designed can encourage and influence better behavior, particularly better driver behavior. We can also use roadway design to design our streets for safe speeds, which is important since we know from comprehensive data that people are less likely to survive high-speed crashes. And this is not only true for people inside of the vehicle, but it is especially true for our communities that are walking and biking. And as Albert pointed out, 41% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. And so if we're able to shift even a small portion of those transportation trips from single occupancy vehicles to walking or biking trips, that's going to have major environmental implications. However, I want to point out people will not choose to walk or bike if it doesn't feel safe to do so. And so when the city approaches all of our transportation projects, we're looking for opportunities to improve traffic safety for all roadway users, but especially our more vulnerable roadway users, people walking and biking. Next slide, please. The city passed an updated Complete Streets Ordinance in 2019, which Albert referenced. And just so we're all on the same page, Complete Streets is about retrofitting existing streets or building new streets to be more multimodal. So for over 60 years, American cities have been designing our communities around automobiles. And Complete Streets is about making sure that our streets serve everyone, from people walking, biking, taking transit, and driving. The Complete Streets Ordinance plays a really big role in Vision Zero efforts because each year when the city repaves and rehabs roadways, rather than putting them back the way that they were, a committee of advocate and city representatives look for opportunities to put the streets back better and safer for everyone. If the roadway context supports it and there's enough space, as you can see, this process is a really great opportunity to add bike lanes. We added over 10 miles of bike lanes this year. This process is also a good opportunity to narrow driving lanes, which encourages drivers to slow down. And if there's not enough room for a bike lane and the context does not support it, we can always add buffer striping. So if you look at the bottom right-hand picture, that's on San Mateo near Montgomery, we added buffer striping in between the outside travel lane and the sidewalk to provide a little more comfort for people walking on sidewalks. And this year we tried something new called daylighting. And if you look at that picture in the upper left, daylighting is removing parking right at crosswalks so that all roadway users can see each other, not only people driving, but especially important for people crossing the street. In this day and age, our vehicles are only getting larger. And so removing that, improving that sight distance can enable each of us to see each other better, especially for kids crossing the street. The city has over 4,600 lane miles of roadways, which is a lot. And so Complete Streets and the rehab process is a really great opportunity to implement a lot of safety countermeasures incrementally, which allows people to get used to the roads looking and working differently. Thank you so much for your time. I'm so happy to be here, and I look forward to your questions, and I'd like to pass it on to Carrie.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carrie, and I'm one of 3 planners that work for the City Transit Department, which is also known as ABQ Ride. And to begin with, I would like to focus on how transit relates to climate and sustainability. A well-functioning transit system can reduce the need for everyone to have a personal vehicle. This not only helps reduce costs for personal household budgets, it also reduces the amount of embodied energy that is used to build and operate vehicles. Also, reducing the number of vehicles on the street can lower traffic congestion and decrease vehicle emissions and air pollutions, which are both contributors to climate challenges. However, for transit to be sustainable, we need a pretty high amount of ridership. It takes 12 passengers on a bus for the bus travel to have less impact than a single occupancy vehicle. And finally, it can improve public health through an improved air quality. And because riders are also more active in their travel, that tends to contribute to healthier lifestyles. Next slide, please. We have a few ongoing programs or initiatives that specifically relate to sustainability. And to encourage more people to ride, we have implemented the Zero Fare program. In this program, the purpose is to encourage more ridership and to reduce transportation costs for the most vulnerable people by waiving all transit fares. And this is served to increase ridership slightly. And it's something that we are ongoing and evaluating right now. This is the end of the first year, which it was meant to be a one-year program, but council has added additional funding to get us through next July, and they're just having conversations about some changes or tweaks to the program. The second point, our marketing department has been very active going to public events and on social media. And some of their priorities is to do more job recruiting because we have a pretty large deficit in drivers and mechanics. So if you know anyone looking for a job, we're hiring. They also are encouraging people to switch to transit and teaching transit ridership skills, such as how to load your bike, how to use passes and route planning, and the different tools and apps that we have to help facilitate your travel. Finally, we're working on developing new park and ride facilities to encourage more ridership and collect people that may live in semi-rural or rural areas that are low density and they can't be well served by transit. So a park and ride is a way to collect people to a higher frequency route and then bring them to the more dense areas in the city, such as UNM and the hospitals where it's harder to park in those areas. So there's like more of an incentive to use transit in those locations. Next slide. Here's some of the things that we're planning to do in the future. The first one is that we're transitioning to a low or no emission vehicle fleet. And currently we only have 5 electric buses. And with the present technology in electric vehicles, we would need over 300 more to replace our fleet of 160 full-size buses. Our fleet today right now is a blend of compressed natural gas buses and then hybrid electric diesel buses. The next point, we are continuously working on bus stop and shelter enhancements. We're looking at different amenities and different shelters, structures or bench options. Also working on keeping them cleaned and maintained. And then we're rolling out a new signage package because a lot of our signs are pretty weather worn and some of them are barely legible due to the sun fading them. So you may have seen them on a few routes. I think it's 36 and 37 were the first routes with the new signage package. It's really pretty. And moving on to our biggest priority, we're working on the ABQ Ride Forward network plan. This plan basically is intended to guide where buses go, when they run, and how frequently they run. And it's a long, I guess it's a big picture vision of how we would redo our network if we were just starting from scratch instead of tinkering with the system we have. And so we've hired Jarrett Walker and Associates, which is an internationally known firm that has really strong expertise in doing this type of work. Next slide. So the project, what we're in the process of doing is evaluating all routes and all service in order to improve access to transit. This plan and planning effort will evaluate how well we serve low-income neighborhoods, seniors, youth, people with disabilities, and also households without cars. And then this plan also is considering where we might next extend our rapid network. And on the right of the slide is a map of our service. This is a weekday during the midday period. The darker the line, the more frequent services. And so the red lines mean a bus will be coming every 15 minutes. And right now that's along Central, San Mateo, going north-south, and then a short stretch up Louisiana to get to Uptown. There's also some very faint lines. Those are less frequently than once an hour. Some of them are commuter routes, which may only go once in each direction per day. You can see on the map to the left, these are all of our bus stops, and you can compare these to the routes with the most frequent service also have the most boardings. And so the red dots represent the average weekday ridership at each stop. And so I just checked the statistics for this month, and it's approximately 15,000 riders per day, and almost half of them are using the ART buses. And when you include the Route 66, that's over half of our ridership on a daily basis. Next slide. Okay, so these maps explain a very important concept in transit planning. This is access. And so our consultant produced these maps to show basically a service area of where you could get starting at different points in the city. And our project website has, I don't know, maybe 30 of these maps for all different locations in the city. And so each map show how far you can get in a certain amount of time using transit. And so it's kind of like people who primarily drive, they're only can spend maybe a certain amount of time traveling each day. And the rest of the time they have to be doing the other, like eating and being at work or school. So same thing for transit riders. We can only spend a certain amount of time traveling. And these maps show how far you could get in 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or 60 minutes by transit. And you can see on the right map, starting at the University of New Mexico, you can get to many more places than you could if you're starting at Rio Bravo and Coors. And this is due to the street pattern. It's also related to the amount and frequency of transit service and how connections can be made to other transit routes. So how frequently the next bus is going to come, because each of these trips includes the waiting time, waiting for your transfer. The other thing to point out about these, the table at the bottom shows census data that calculates how many residents or jobs are within each travel area. And we're looking at jobs because that's a number that the census tracks, and using that as a proxy for the amount of services and different amenities that you could access within that area also. Next slide. So the other thing we're considering is how many people can use transit. So the map on the right, it shows how walkable our city is, and the darker areas are the most walkable. And it's because they have a well-connected street grid. Transit service is really hard to provide if there's a poor street network. This is because there's long bus trips that are needed, and also long walks to get to the bus stop. So the distance that you can travel is kind of computed into that map from the previous slide. And it really reduces how far you can get if you have to spend the first 20 minutes walking to a bus stop. The map on the left highlights concentrations of vulnerable communities. And so this is based on the same data that Val had presented earlier in the high fatal and injury network. So it's looking at places with low vehicle ownership, high incidence of poverty, I think high numbers of senior and youth who don't tend to be able to drive themselves places. And so we're using this to make sure that any changes we make to the transit system don't disproportionately impact vulnerable communities. And our project website has like a whole series of these demographic maps, including households without a vehicle, where there's higher incidence of poverty, where there's a high job density, higher numbers of seniors or youth. And so all of these maps collectively inform our understanding of where transit's needed. And as a city, part of this network plan is helping us, the consultants are helping us as the transit agency, and in collaboration with the public, to decide how much we want to focus on serving those higher density and mixed use areas with a better connected street grid. And those areas tend to be well served by frequent service. And so that's useful transit because you can kind of go further and make easy connections. We contrast this with the other priority, which is covering the entire city with transit routes, having a route near everyone. And it may come infrequently because we have a large city and it's somewhat disconnected with the river, breaking up the city and making it challenging to kind of access the east and west sides. So this other priority is kind of thinking of transit as a safety net and avoiding isolating anyone who may need to get somewhere to their doctors or to the grocery store, and transit's their only option for travel. So these are two different values, and we as a city need to determine what our priority is. And so throughout this process, we're basically going to decide where our system falls, and it's going to ultimately be a blend of those two different purposes to different degrees. Right now, I found this interesting. Our consultant looking at our existing network, they said we're about 80% towards the ridership, which is providing frequent service to many different people, focusing on the number, having many riders on each bus. And so that's really because of our heavy investment on the Central Corridor, which has higher densities, more vulnerable populations, and also it's well connected with the mix of use. So it's really perfect for transit. Next slide. Finally, this is just information. If you would like to be involved in our ABQ Ride forward planning process, visit our website and sign up for our mailing list so that you can find out about different opportunities that we have. We recently just finished the first phase, and a big part of that was doing a survey, and we collected close to 2,000 responses, and we feel that was a really successful effort, and we're just kind of processing those results. And we'll be back in June for the next phase to look at kind of two different options that balance that ridership or coverage. And it'll be a very interesting conversation. Our webpage has lots of maps and graphics and reports that give you a good understanding of how well transit performs in Albuquerque. And also it lays out these choices that we have to make, where and how we invest in transit service. The other opportunity is you could attend one of our transit advisory board meetings. Those are on the second Thursday of every month. This link is on our webpage if you forget since you can't really click through right now. But with that, I will pass it on to Christopher, who also I will shout out to him as the most recent past chair of the Transit Advisory Board. So thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Just want to say it's really great to be able to participate, and thank you, Albert and Sandra. We were able to present last year in the process of creating the city's climate action plan, and thanks for inviting us back. I want to do some things, and some of you I see on the participant list are very familiar with Together for Brothers and community organizing, but wanted to kind of provide a context where I really want to appreciate both Valerie and Carrie, because one of the things that we're lifting up again, and what Sandra said, is we're trying to really make sure our climate action plan as a city really includes participation by community, and especially most impacted community, or as you've heard Valerie and Carrie refer to, vulnerable communities, and some of the indexes the city is creating to make sure that there's universal language across departments in the city when it comes to that. I want to also give some language around equality and equity, and this is work we do with the brothers, but for sure work we do with the community as well. You are all probably very familiar with the idea of equality, where everybody gets the same. We want to talk about equity because that is where the most impacted communities get what they need and deserve. And we really recognize some of the historic disinvestment by structures, both institutions and systems. And this is why it's important that we really feel that it's a great priority that in all of the efforts that you're hearing about, we're really thinking of an equity lens that does identify vulnerable communities through data, right? Through the information that we have available as a city. And when we don't have that data, I appreciate the city has created some opportunities to identify ways that we can find that data. I also want to thank our Indigenous communities. We recognize, right, that we're on Indigenous land. One of the things in our organizing with Together for Brothers, we recognize we've learned about sovereignty from Indigenous communities. And really that next piece, besides equality and equity, is sovereignty. It's that people get to self-determine, right? Get to determine for themselves, and they get to be part of a larger decision making. Those are two key aspects of sovereignty. Indigenous communities have other aspects as well, but those are two aspects I want to bring into as we think of definitions for the next slide that Sandra is going to share with us, which really is transit equity, right? We want for us to understand part of the climate action plan has to address most impacted communities or transit dependent bus riders get the transit they need and deserve. And what's really important about this, and I realized I want to make a really important correlation. Transit dependent bus riders are also in those vulnerable communities, the people most likely to be most impacted by climate injustice, right? By environmental racism and by the impacts of climate change. So what's really important about transit equity is that we're addressing climate justice and climate change by recognizing those vulnerable communities or most impacted communities. And again, equity means that some people are going to get more. And I appreciate that about the ABQ Ride Forward, because we're starting to, as a city, identify that we might need to invest in particular communities and not give everybody the same. In the next slide, I also want to introduce the concept of mobility sovereignty. So we heard the difference between equality and equity. We also heard that sovereignty is about self-determination and being part of decision-making. So I want to make sure that when we think of our climate action plan, that we're thinking of communities most impacted. In the case of climate action plan and transit or transportation, want to think about transit-dependent bus riders, which you heard Valerie and Carrie both talk about how those are being prioritized as vulnerable communities or other data indicators in both of the previous presentations, but that those transit-dependent bus riders get what they need and also make their own decisions about transportation. That's that self-determination, and are also at the decision-making table about accessible and affordable, ideally free. T4B did a health impact assessment in 2017 and 2018. And one of the things I want to have you all hear is that we found in 2018 that 90% of frequent or daily bus riders had experienced not having the fare at least once in the past month. And so we want to make sure that's why zero fares is important. That's actually why we prioritized 5 years of community organizing around zero fares, because that's what bus riders told us. It also includes equitable transit, such as clean transit, and that includes electric vehicles. I'm going to remind you, Sandra did give us that really good frame. That's the next meeting, so we're not talking about that tonight. But I do want to make sure what you're hearing is, and I see Steve and others who participate in the active transportation committee, right, that Valerie is also part of, Bike Through Birthday Week, which we've been part of. That includes biking, but also mobility for people with disabilities. And I want to lift this up because I think it's an opportunity in the vulnerable communities, because I don't know if the city's using that. We know this. The International District has the highest concentration of people with disabilities in the city. It's also the highest concentration of low-income people and of people of color, with the most languages spoken in the city. So we want to look at mobility for people with disabilities and walking. And when I say biking, mobility for people with disabilities and walking, I want to lift up that one of the pieces of the climate action plan is how it connects to what Carrie was sharing about bus shelters and other infrastructure like sidewalks, lighting, and crosswalks, so that people can safely walk, right, Carrie, and access that transit in their communities, or that last mile, where often the bus might not take you to the door of where you're going or the door of your home, but if you're getting to work, school, healthcare, outdoor recreation, or other resources, we want to make sure that everyone has an equitable access to being able to bike, be mobile as a person with disability, or walk. Next slide, Sandra. I also just want to take a moment to recognize there's been so many people, and some of you actually I see in the audience, who've been part of the 5 years of transit equity organizing that we've been doing. Want to definitely do a shout out to the city, who has worked with us since 2019 to recognize Rosa Parks' birthday on February 4th as Transit Equity Day. We have lobbied at the city, the state, and even the federal level to really expand opportunities for transit equity, which again includes accessible and affordable, ideally free transit for most impacted communities. But again, definitely the mayor and city, including transit, has done a lot to make sure that we are addressing transit equity. In the last 5 years, that has significantly changed. And we're a role model for the rest of the country. Next slide, Sandra. So I mentioned Transit Equity Day earlier. I'm going to say it again. We're excited. This is how we were able to get really great things like free student passes. We added, and that was in 2020. We also in 2021 added seniors and veterans. And of course, our big victory in 2021 was getting the adoption of zero fares, with Councilor Santa adding $3 million for the first year pilot. And then Carrie also mentioned we added another 6 years, another $1.5 million for the 6 months of the full fiscal year we're currently in. So that takes us all the way to June. Please join us for Transit Equity Day on February 4th. We're already starting to plan, and we would love your ideas. Next slide. And we look forward to working, Sandra and Albert, with sustainability and making sure that you all are part of that Transit Equity Day as well. Just want to remind us as we think of a climate action plan that we're really thinking of community organizing. Sandra mentioned, and I'm going to do a plug, our participation as a community, especially with most impacted communities. And I think of folks that I see, for example, like Althea. I think you're still here. Yep. Althea is a bus rider who's been participating, and Althea understands community organizing is about building power so that we understand everybody in our community has the power to be able to be a part of this public participation. We want to improve lives. Valerie and Carrie have already mentioned how there's particular pieces of the work that we're doing in Vision Zero, but also, right, Valerie, your work with Bike to Burke and other opportunities where we're trying to make sure that we're improving lives and moving that needle towards zero traffic fatalities or injuries. And the same with what Carrie shared. We're improving lives of people who are especially transit dependent bus riders, but also choice riders as well. And then we're shifting relations of power. And one really great example is what we're all doing tonight. We're being part of a climate action plan for the city, and your participation is part of shifting relations that we're having the city here, that the public needs to be part of making the decision about how we move forward with climate justice and climate action in our city. Next slide, Sandra. And then one of the things as we think of climate action, and not just for transit, but all the work we do around the climate action plan, want to remind us that issues are the problems and solutions. We often get stuck, right, in the presenting problem. I also want to remind us that we need to go deeper and look at root causes. A great example is we only have 5 of our 250 bus fleet right now that is electric. One of the problems is we're told elevation's an issue in Albuquerque, right? Unfortunately, right, Carrie, our electric buses often lose steam when it comes to hitting the different altitudes and hills in Albuquerque. So we see more electric buses being used north-south versus east and west, right? But what we do need to do is continue to push transit to convert those sun vans and buses when possible, and find resources at the state and federal level to do exactly what Carrie said. But we need to understand the root cause of, if there isn't the technology now, or one of the things I recently learned, our mechanics are not well-versed in electric bus maintenance. How could we, it makes me think of opportunities with C&M to do investments in electric bus maintenance training so that we create career pathways for Albuquerque to be able to have a much bigger electric bus and van fleet. I also want to remind us that part of root causes is thinking about systems change. And you heard tonight that I'm excited that our climate action plan addresses that, right? We know it's that idea of we don't want to just pull babies out of the river. We want to go upstream and really identify how can we have a climate action plan that addresses systems change and shift culture in our community, which means more people taking the bus, more people being able to safely bike, be mobile with their disabilities, and also walk in our communities. Next slide, Sandra. So I want to make sure, just like Carrie and Valerie did, this is a call to action. A climate action plan cannot be Albert and Sandra, right? We can't put that all on you. So I want to make sure you know Together for Brothers has done something incredible this past year. We developed an Albuquerque Bus Rider Union. We have monthly meetings. So we want to encourage you to check out and join us for monthly meetings. And excited to also kind of shout out Althea. We're going to start hiring bus rider organizers. Althea is one of our first bus riders we've identified to help us do outreach to other bus riders. Want to also encourage you, Carrie did a shout out of how to be part of the next part of public participation with the Ride Forward. It is going to be up to us to reimagine a whole public transit system. And by the way, that was 4 years of us working with ABQ Ride after City Council had given money to make that happen. So I want to make sure that everybody gets to participate. And I want to lift up T4B was a part of that because we used some of our grant money to do stipends for bus riders to attend focus groups and participate in the ABQ Ride Forward work that happened in the past couple of months, because we think it's important for most impacted communities, including transit dependent bus riders, to be part of that. Also be part of Climate Action Plan. You're going to hear tonight a little bit more, right, Sandra and Albert, ways that people can, and we want to hear your voice and questions tonight. And then also Vision Zero. But Valerie, can I do a shout out to Bike Through Burke and Bike to Anywhere Day? We've been part of the planning for both of those, and it's really important that communities show up. I know I recognize some of the names from some of you who've been part of that planning, but can I do a quick shout out? We suggested in the Bike to Wherever Day that we add stops in the International District. And I love that San Pedro Library was added and was one of the most frequently stopped sites for, wait a minute, was that Bike to Burke or Bike to Wherever Day? Now I'm confused. Valerie might be able to tell me which day that was.
Well, it's Bike to Wherever Day.
Bike to Wherever Day. So I love that we've added, and thinking about, again, where are those most impacted communities? Save the date for transit equity. And one last shout out, Sandra and Albert, before I give it back to you all. Carrie, you didn't mention one really great thing that I love that one of our Zero Fares Coalition partners worked with transit on. And that is, we did a promotional media campaign on social media and posters on buses to promote which bus routes take you to outdoor recreation spaces in the city. So I love, Carrie, that, and I'm hoping we can see more opportunities to really promote that the buses get us to so many places. But I love that you all promoted some of the city, county, state, and federal outdoor spaces that currently ABQ Ride takes you to. So I want to lift that up. And it reminds me, Carrie, I want to do a shout out because Transit mentioned that they have some of those big posters left over from the Alvarado Transit Center that I would love to follow up with you and get, because we'd love to put those up in other spaces to remind people. But that's one example of how community can work together, right, Sandra and Albert, which I think is the next step of our public participation is key to making our city not only more transit equitable, but really address climate change and climate justice.
Thank you so much, Christopher, and all of our presenters this evening. In the light of trying to get to your questions as soon as possible, I'm going to try to keep my section short. I'm posting right now links in the chat that follow that basically are the resources that are listed here. So what's next? Next meeting, we have these about quarterly will be about electric vehicles and buses. So again, all the stuff about that will be coming soon. And I know, thank you again for the comments and questions that are already in the chat. If you have additional questions that you would like to pose in the chat from our presenters, feel free to put those in right now. You'll find on our on the website, we already have the summary of the progress from when the CAP goals were made. For that first year is provided in the 2022 Climate Action Plan implementation report. Resources that our presenters mentioned here are in a resources document that's also linked there, as well as in the chat. And then soon, after a few hours after this meeting, we'll have the recording of the meeting, the feedback forms, which I'll talk about in a minute, which will be open through the end of January. And then in February, you'll see the meeting minutes from today's meeting, as well as summary of the feedback. So how can you help? Well, that really comes down to sharing feedback. So I just put links to the feedback forms in the chat. They will be on the website soon. We have questions that our presenters gave input to that really will help focus your feedback on the things that we can use to directly guide our programs during this implementation phase. So it's really community input is key and incredibly important for ensuring that these programs continue to align with your vision of a healthy, equitable, and resilient Albuquerque. So please fill out those forms, spread them, pick one. We only need to do one language. There's English and Spanish, and then share them as much as possible so that we can hear as many voices as we can. So with that, let's open it up for questions. I would like to, we'll go through questions as much as we can. If we don't have time for any in the chat, we will answer those through the meeting minutes afterwards, hopefully, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. Hopefully we can get to them all. In light of the time, if you would like to provide verbal comments or questions, we're just going to limit that time to a minute so that we can hear as many voices as possible. If you do want to provide verbal questions or verbal comments, please use the raise your hand option. And then we'll, or if that is not working for you, you can put a message in the chat and we'll get to you, prioritizing the verbal comments first, because we can always answer the other comments in the meeting minutes. So I will give you a second to do that. Looking for hands raised. And in the meantime, we'll start with the first question in the chat. And that probably is going to be directed towards Valerie. It's, are you pursuing connected and protected bike lanes?
It's a great question. It's something that we would like to do. The city does not currently have any separated or protected bicycle infrastructure. Our committee called the Greater Albuquerque Active Transportation Committee, also known as GATSI, we've had a few months of discussions at 2 meetings, August and September. Our city traffic engineer and I are interested in piloting that to identify what type of materials, the type of cost, the durability, and how long those materials can last. So I encourage you to reach out or to participate in GATSI and provide public comment because GATSI does direct the city, the council, the mayor's office on a lot of our active transportation projects. So it's important for them to hear from you. And you'll notice in that feedback form that Sandra mentioned, that's actually one of my questions for folks, because trying to get support to be able to do those types of things. And then just one last note, we are looking to do a pilot probably on Martin Luther King in between Broadway and the freeway, because that's a highly trafficked area. There's already buffered bike lanes. It would be an easy quote unquote location to be able to do a pilot project. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Seeing no raised hands at this time, we'll go to the next question. Oh, we just got one. Oh, is that Christopher? Would you like to ask a question?
I actually just want to lift up something that's in the chat from earlier, Sandra, and I really appreciate, I know that Valerie, we talk about this a lot in GATSI, but also with Vision Zero, appreciating the comment around talking about, would love to see the miles of bike paths in different parts of the city. And that would be, I was thinking about that just the other day. It would be awesome to actually have both a map, but also a representation to see where we do have bike lanes. What we know of in the International District in Westgate is that we see less bike lanes in those communities than in other parts of the city. So just wanted to lift up that particular question around the miles. What does it look like? And so I think that's a great question that I know we can't answer tonight, but we should be able to look at for the future.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Christopher. And Steve, I see your hand raised. Go ahead and speak. You're unmuted, but I'm not able to hear you. Is anyone else able to hear? Maybe get closer to the mic, perhaps. Not sure. Okay, feel free to troubleshoot a little bit. I'll leave you unmuted while we go to the next question in the chat. If you want to add anything into the chat, I'm sorry that you're having technical difficulties, and I appreciate your patience with the technology. I'd like to invite our speakers at this time to look at, there are a series of questions that were asked relatively early in the chat by Alex Applegate that are referring to tracking intersections and bike lanes. And I'd like to allow you all to decide who would best field that and to answer those. If you have any questions around them, let me know.
Yeah, I'm looking at the first question. So the question is related to bicycle lanes ending prior to intersections. And for future, can we track how many intersections we've changed to eliminate this gap? So I'll answer the first part. Yes, that is a challenge. And we have, transportation planning, particularly bicycle and pedestrian planning, has changed astronomically in the last decade. And so, as I mentioned, we have 4,600 miles of streets, and I wish I could snap my fingers and just fix all of our problems. And so it's going to have to be an incremental approach. And that is one that we're aware of. It is called out in the Complete Streets Ordinance. And so when we do, repurpose our roadways or build new roadways, it's something we look at, trying to carry that bike lane through, or at least include some type of sharrow to indicate that there is a bicyclist passing through the intersection. Another best practice is putting up a sign called may use full lane. That's the new standard, rather than share the road. As far as tracking that, I don't know that we have capacity to be able to do that, but I am making note of that. We are currently working on a better transportation tracking system and tracking all of the safety countermeasures that we're implementing in the city and where. And so maybe that's one we can look into adding. Right turns on red are bad for cyclists. Yes, they are. Can we work to eliminate these? I think if the roadway context supports it and it's a bikeway facility that makes sense, then yes, we can look at that, and we do look at that. One example I can think of is on Louisiana, Trumbull, Southern, and Catherine. We had a road safety audit back in 2020, and one of the report recommendations was to add leading pedestrian intervals, which is a signal change in which pedestrians get a head start in crossing the street. And typically when you implement those, you do no red on red. So not only does it benefit people bicycling, but it benefits people walking as well. And then, let's see, loop detectors make cyclists run red lights. And I guess I'm not understanding that question. I think we would want to keep loop detectors at certain signalized intersections so that when a bicyclist approaches the intersection, the signal will change. And then typically where those are, it gives extra time to accommodate a person going through the intersection on a bicycle. So hopefully that helps answer those questions.
And then we have, within light with having about 4 minutes left, we have 2 hands raised. So I'm going to switch over to those. Thank you very much, Valerie. Oh, we have Carrie. Would you like to answer one of the questions? About the ABQ Ride Forward survey and when we can see the results?
Sure, yeah. I just so everyone knows, I collected all of the questions so that we can work on responding to them. The survey results have not yet been finalized, but we did a spring survey and that's posted on our project webpage. And as soon as we get the results for this more qualitative and in-depth survey that we did in October, we'll also post that and send an email out to our list. So that's a good reason to get on our email list. But actually, I see all the questions about kind of first and last mile connections, and that's something that maybe offline we can continue those conversations. But the one that I found the most fascinating as a land use planner was Alex's question about the greenest way to move people is not to move them. What plans does the city have to increase the density of housing? And so that's something that in my prior 10 years working in the planning department, we actually did a lot of changes to the city's zoning system. It's called the Integrated Development Ordinance. And that is one of the major priorities, is to identify where our corridors are that we're going to have a higher capacity transit service, and then try to encourage more mixed uses and apartments and higher density uses in those locations. So one of the big changes was almost all of our commercial zones citywide, where before our change, you could only do kind of commercial uses on those properties or office or industrial uses. And now many of them are mixed use. So a property owner can now develop apartments on a vacant lot, or if you have an old office building that you're having trouble renting, you could convert some of those to residential units. And that's also part of the mayor's housing forward effort to try to get hotel and office conversions to add more housing throughout the city. And so by policy, we changed our rules so that less parking is required on transit corridors and more building height and more density is allowed. And so we're hoping that those gentle incentives are ways to focus development in those locations. And so we've been tracking development requests and approvals that have happened along Central, and doing the art project actually has spurred a lot of development and redevelopment, and a lot of that is residential. So we see that it's successful, and we're hoping that focusing the development rules and the transit service and kind of aligning them that transit-oriented development will be spurred. And the transit department ourselves, we're working on a transit-oriented development in Uptown at the Uptown Transit Center. So hopefully in the next 5 years, we'll see something happening there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carrie. In light of the fact that we're almost out of time, we'll definitely go to, I see Eric, we'll get your comment or question as well, but I wanted to make a quick mention that the recording will be available a few hours after this meeting. I need to have time to get the link from the cloud. It'll be on the website. The website's in the chat again, and you can share it by sharing information with the website. The feedback forms will be linked there as well, just a few hours after. So with that, Eric, would you please unmute and share your question or comment?
Sure. I just wanted to follow up on the point about loop detectors. They typically don't detect bicycles at intersections. And I know this from experience, riding a very heavily loaded bicycle that weighs a lot, still doesn't trigger that loop detector. So the bike is stuck at the red light. So they can either decide to run the red light or dismount and push the beg button on the sidewalk, which is often difficult, or they're stuck waiting there until a car arrives to trigger the loop detector. So that's the issue that Alex was referring to.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. I really appreciate that. And then just so you know, we are looking to add bike loop detectors. So when you do pull up to an intersection, you will get picked up and it will trigger the signal to change. And it also adds time so that you can get through safely.
Okay, that's an encouraging development. I would just also ask, and this is probably more of a city council thing, but to consider some variant of the safety stop law that's been implemented in states like Idaho, Colorado, which would allow a cyclist to treat a street light like a stop sign. And if they find that it's safe to proceed, they could proceed through a red light legally. And the similar rule would apply for stop sign intersections, which would allow a cyclist to treat it as a yield rather than a stop if it's safe to proceed.
I would love to see that too. I think that would be both city council and it'd probably also be state. I think the state traffic codes would need to change too.
Agreed. You're probably right. And it's something I would advocate for at that level too. But it's a solution that doesn't require additional infrastructure to be much more affordable. It just takes some education and of both citizenry and enforcement.
Thank you very much for that comment, Eric. And with respect to everybody's time, there are a couple questions that we did not get to. Today we have documented all of those, and we will have all of our panelists today be able to respond. They may also have additional information on any of the questions that were answered, and that will all be in the meeting minutes posted to the website. Thank you all so much for attending. Please fill out the feedback form. Thank you for sharing your questions and your comments. And with that, I hope you have a great night and rest of your year.